Captain Jaden's spaceship shuddered violently as flames licked at its hull. The control panels blared warnings in steady, urgent tones. A few moments ago, the vessel had been gliding peacefully through deep space, far from any known star systems. Now it was plummeting, spiraling uncontrollably toward the surface of a mysterious, glowing planet below. "Brace for impact." Jaden's voice cut through the chaos. The small crew strapped into their seats, their faces pale and tense. None of them had ever seen a planet quite like this. Swirling clouds of ash and smoke veiled its surface, pierced only by rivers of molten lava that crisscrossed its landscape like veins of fire. A heat warning blinked red on every console. The atmospheric entry was brutal, but there was no other choice. It was land or burn up. The ship slammed into the ground with a bone-rattling thud. Sparks rained from the ceiling, and a cascade of loose wires fell from above, but somehow, the vessel held together. For several moments, only the sound of heavy breathing and the occasional crackle of cooling metal filled the cabin. Jaden unfastened their harness and stood, scanning the damaged bridge. "Status report," they said, voice steady but low. "We're mostly intact," replied Eris, the crew's tech specialist. They wiped a streak of soot from their cheek and squinted at the console in front of them. "Engines are shot. Hull integrity is down to 40%. Atmospheric processors are struggling, but still functional. For now." "What's the surface temperature outside?" Jaden asked, already expecting the worst. Eris hesitated. "Around 600 degrees Fahrenheit in the immediate vicinity. Higher near the lava flows. The atmosphere's thick with particulate matter and unbreathable without suits." Jaden nodded, their jaw tight. They turned toward Lyra, the navigator. "What do we know about this planet? Do we have any idea where we are?" Lyra shook her head. "It's not on any of our charts. No recorded star system matches its location, and the readings we're getting, they don't make sense. It's as if this place shouldn't exist." As the crew absorbed the navigator's unsettling words, another alert chirped from the console. This one was different. Softer. Almost hopeful. Eris frowned at the display. "That's strange. I'm picking up a faint biosignal. It's very weak, but it's there." Jaden walked over, leaning over Eris's shoulder to peer at the screen. "Could it be one of ours? A beacon from another ship?" "I don't think so," Eris replied. "It's not coming from standard tech. It's organic, definitely alive. Not human." The room fell silent. The crew exchanged glances. If there was life on this fiery world, it had to be extraordinarily resilient. But why had their sensors picked it up now? What could survive in these conditions? Jaden straightened, their decision made. "Suit up. We're going out there to find it." The crew hesitated. Eris spoke up first. "Captain, with respect, this place isn't just hostile, it's a death trap. The longer we stay out there, the less chance we have of making it back." "I know the risks," Jaden said, meeting their gaze firmly. "But if there's a chance, any chance, that someone or something is alive out there and needs help, we can't just sit here. We're explorers. We help those in need. That's why we're here in the first place." Eris looked unconvinced, but they nodded, beginning the process of donning a heat-resistant suit. One by one, the crew followed suit, their movements tense but practiced. Jaden's suit hissed as it sealed around them, and they stepped toward the airlock. The metal hatch groaned open, revealing the inferno outside. Waves of heat hit them immediately, even through the suit's protective layers. The ground was a blackened crust, glowing faintly red in places, and the air shimmered with heat mirages. "Keep comms open," Jaden instructed. "If you see anything unusual, report it immediately. And stay close." They moved out in single file, the ship's bright hull a stark contrast against the burning landscape. The beacon was faint, but it led them toward a cluster of jagged rocks. The terrain was treacherous, sharp obsidian shards jutted out of the ground, and the crew had to step carefully to avoid slipping into molten crevices. Every so often, the ground trembled underfoot, a reminder that this world was far from stable. As they approached the signal source, the crew began to notice something odd. Among the ash and soot, faint streaks of a silvery substance glinted in the dim light. It looked almost like a trail, deliberate, as if something had passed through here and left behind a residue. "Captain, this doesn't look natural," Lyra said, crouching to examine the silvery streaks. "It's not rock, and it's not lava. It's something else." Jaden nodded. "Mark it for analysis later. Let's keep moving." They rounded a large outcropping, and the beacon's signal grew stronger. And then they saw it. A small figure lay curled against a rock, its form barely visible through the heat waves. It was about half the size of a human, with smooth, iridescent skin that shimmered faintly even in the oppressive heat. One of its limbs was tucked awkwardly beneath it, as if injured. Eris knelt beside the creature, running a quick scan with their handheld device. "It's alive, but barely. Broken limb, dehydration, and severe thermal stress." Jaden studied the alien youngling carefully. Despite the harsh conditions, it had clearly fought to survive. The silvery trail led straight to it, as if it had crawled here, perhaps seeking shelter among the rocks. "Can we move it?" Jaden asked. Eris hesitated. "I can stabilize it for now, but we'll have to be careful. If we're too rough, it might not make it." "Do what you can," Jaden said. "We can't leave it here." As Eris worked to stabilize the youngling, Lyra kept watch, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Captain, the ground's getting hotter. We need to get back to the ship soon." Jaden nodded. "Understood. Eris, how's it coming?" "Almost done. I've given it something to help with the pain. It's still weak, but we can carry it." Carefully, Jaden lifted the youngling into their arms. It was lighter than expected, its smooth skin cool to the touch despite the heat. The creature stirred faintly, a low, warbling sound escaping its throat. "We've got you," Jaden said softly. "You're safe now." The crew began their return journey, but the landscape had changed. The tremors were growing more frequent, and thin cracks in the ground began to widen, spilling molten rock into their path. The once faint roar of the volcanoes was now a deafening thunder. "Captain, the volcano's activity is increasing," Lyra warned. "We need to move faster." Jaden quickened their pace, the youngling held securely in their arms. The crew followed closely, their suits' filters struggling to keep the ash and smoke at bay. They were close, just a few hundred meters from the ship, when the ground beneath them shook violently. A fissure opened up, spewing molten lava into the air. The crew stumbled, scrambling to avoid the fiery spray. "Keep moving," Jaden shouted, their voice cutting through the chaos. With every step, the heat intensified. The youngling whimpered softly, its body trembling against Jaden's chest. Despite the odds, they pushed forward, determination etched into every move. The ship's outline grew larger, their beacon of hope in this world of fire. But as they reached the final stretch, the ground split open again, this time directly in their path. The molten chasm was wide, the glowing lava below casting an eerie orange light on their faces. They had to find another way, or risk everything to cross. Jaden set their jaw, scanning the terrain. The crew looked to them for guidance, fear and exhaustion written across their soot-covered faces. This rescue mission had become far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. "We'll find a way," Jaden said, their voice steady. "We're not leaving anyone behind, not this youngling, not each other. Let's move." The chasm yawned before them, a river of molten fire splitting the ground in two. Waves of heat radiated upward, distorting the air and sending shimmering ripples across the crew's vision. Captain Jaden stood at the edge, sweat beading inside their heat-resistant suit despite its cooling systems. The youngling in their arms whimpered faintly, a weak sound barely audible over the constant roar of the fiery planet. "This doesn't look good," Eris muttered, peering into the glowing depths. Their visor reflected the orange light, giving their expression a ghostly quality. "We can't just jump this. It's too wide." Jaden nodded, scanning the surrounding terrain. "We'll have to find another way around." They gestured for the crew to follow, and the group began to skirt the edge of the fissure, moving cautiously along the unstable ground. Each step felt perilous. Cracks would appear suddenly, spilling molten rock onto their path, and every tremor threatened to send them tumbling into the abyss. Lyra glanced back, her voice tight. "Captain, the volcanic activity is getting worse. If we don't hurry, this whole area could collapse." "I know," Jaden said, keeping their voice calm. "We'll find a crossing point soon. We just need to." A sudden blast interrupted them. A geyser of flame shot up from the ground ahead, forcing the group to stumble back. The intense heat scorched the air, even through their suits. The youngling stirred in Jaden's arms, its body quivering in distress. Eris swore under their breath. "We can't keep going this way. The whole planet's falling apart." Jaden's grip on the youngling tightened. They took a steadying breath, trying to focus. Panic wouldn't help them now. "Eris, how far are we from the ship if we keep heading south?" Eris quickly consulted their portable scanner. "If we can find a way past this fissure, maybe a few kilometers. But that's if the ground stays stable." "Understood," Jaden said. "Let's move. We'll find a break in the ridge and cross there." The crew pressed on, their movements tense and deliberate. The terrain grew more treacherous, with the ground beneath them cracking and shifting unpredictably. At one point, they had to climb over a jagged outcrop, their suits groaning under the strain of the heat. The youngling made faint, mewling noises, and Jaden murmured soothing words to it, hoping to keep it calm. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a narrower section of the fissure. The molten river still churned below, but it was a manageable jump. The crew gathered at the edge, exchanging uncertain glances. "I'll go first," Jaden said. They adjusted their grip on the youngling, then stepped back to get a running start. As the ground trembled again, they sprinted forward and leapt. The landing was rough. Jaden stumbled and fell to one knee, the weight of the youngling throwing them off balance. But they made it. Rising quickly, they turned and waved the others over. "One at a time. I'll catch you if you slip." Eris went next, landing with a grunt beside Jaden. Then Lyra, who barely made it across. The ground shifted again, and the fissure widened slightly, sending sparks flying into the air. Finally, Malin, the last crew member, jumped, just as the edge crumbled beneath their feet. Jaden lunged forward, catching Malin's arm before they could fall. With a sharp pull, they hauled Malin to safety, and the group collapsed in a heap on the other side, their breaths heavy inside their helmets. "That was too close," Malin muttered, their voice shaky. "We need to get off this planet. Fast." "We're not leaving without the youngling," Jaden said firmly, standing and adjusting their hold on the small creature. "Let's keep moving." The landscape changed as they moved south. The fissures became less frequent, though the heat remained oppressive. Towering pillars of rock loomed around them, some glowing red-hot, others blackened and cracked. Pools of molten lava bubbled nearby, their surface shimmering like liquid gold. The youngling began to stir more frequently. It lifted its small, elongated head, making soft, warbling sounds. Eris paused to glance back. "It's waking up. Is that normal?" "I think it's trying to communicate," Jaden said. "It's more aware than we thought." As they continued, the youngling squirmed, reaching a thin, delicate arm toward the east. Its motions grew more insistent, as if it wanted to lead them in that direction. Jaden frowned, glancing toward the east. It was away from the direct path to the ship, but if the youngling knew a safer route. "What do you think?" they asked the crew. Lyra hesitated. "If it knows something we don't, it might be worth checking out. This place is unpredictable, and any advantage we can get." "Fine," Jaden said. "Let's follow it, but keep an eye on our heading. We still need to get back to the ship." The youngling's guidance proved surprisingly helpful. It led them to a rocky pass where the ground was cooler, the air slightly clearer. They even found a small, bubbling spring of water, hot, but still drinkable once filtered through their suit systems. The crew took a brief break, allowing themselves a moment to regroup. "This little one's smarter than it looks," Eris said, watching the youngling curiously. Jaden nodded. "I think it knows we're trying to help. We just need to keep it alive long enough to get it off this rock." Their rest was cut short by a distant rumble. Another tremor shook the ground, and the crew scrambled to their feet. The youngling chirped sharply, pulling at Jaden's suit as if urging them onward. "Looks like break time's over," Jaden said. "Let's go." The terrain became more erratic, forcing the crew to climb over jagged boulders and navigate narrow ledges. The youngling continued to guide them, its movements becoming more confident despite its injuries. It seemed to sense the safest paths, leading them away from unstable ground and steering them clear of newly formed fissures. Eventually, they reached a vantage point. From the elevated position, they could see the faint glimmer of their ship's hull in the distance. The sight was a relief, proof that they were heading in the right direction. But it also highlighted the challenges ahead. Between them and the ship lay a sprawling field of geysers, each one shooting flames and molten rock high into the air. "This just keeps getting better," Eris muttered. "How are we supposed to cross that?" Jaden studied the geyser field carefully. The eruptions were intermittent, with brief pauses between bursts. If they timed it right, they could make it across. "We'll move in short bursts," Jaden said. "When a geyser goes off, we wait. The moment it stops, we run to the next safe spot. Everyone stay close. No one moves alone." The crew nodded, their exhaustion tempered by determination. With the youngling tucked securely in Jaden's arms, they made their way into the fiery field. The first few runs were nerve-wracking. The ground trembled with each eruption, and the heat intensified as they darted from one safe spot to the next. The youngling clung to Jaden, its chirps becoming more frequent, as if urging them to hurry. At one point, a geyser erupted unexpectedly just as they were crossing. The crew barely made it to cover, the flames licking at their suits. Jaden shielded the youngling as best they could, their heart pounding. "Everyone okay?" they asked, breathing hard. "Barely," Lyra replied, her voice strained. "This is insane." "It's the only way," Jaden said firmly. "We keep moving." They continued, each step a gamble, each pause a moment of agonizing tension. By the time they reached the far side of the field, their suits were battered, their bodies exhausted, but they were alive. The youngling nuzzled against Jaden's arm, its faint chirp sounding almost grateful. The ship was closer now, just a few hundred meters away. The crew could see the jagged outcrop where it had landed, the faint glimmer of its emergency lights blinking through the ash-filled air. But as they approached, a low growl echoed through the landscape. The ground trembled again, this time with a rhythm that felt unnatural. The crew froze, scanning their surroundings. "What now?" Eris whispered, their voice barely audible over the planet's constant roar. Jaden tightened their grip on the youngling, their eyes narrowing. "Stay alert. We're not done yet." As the crew drew closer to the ship, the distant growl became louder, more insistent. The youngling stirred again in Jaden's arms, making a series of low, trilling noises. It pointed a thin, trembling arm toward the source of the sound, its gestures growing more urgent. Jaden glanced down at it. You hear it too, don't you? They glanced at the crew. Something's out there. Everyone, keep your eyes open. The ground trembled again. Not the slow, rumbling tremors they'd been enduring, but shorter, more rhythmic vibrations. It felt like footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and drawing closer. Captain, Lyra said, her voice hushed, what if it's something alive? Jaden stopped, turning to address the crew. It could be, but we don't know if it's hostile. We keep moving toward the ship. Stay alert, but don't engage unless absolutely necessary. They adjusted the youngling in their arms and set a brisk pace. The terrain was rough, jagged rocks jutted from the ground like teeth, and the heat shimmered around them, making every step feel like wading through fire. The ship's blinking emergency lights were a beacon ahead, but the crew's focus was divided. The growl turned into a deep, resonating sound, like a massive engine revving in the distance. Eris glanced back nervously. It's getting closer. Should we? A shadow passed over them, long and sinuous. The crew froze, looking up. Through the hazy air, something moved, something big. It was hard to make out the exact shape, but the outline was enough to set their hearts racing. Jaden tightened their grip on the youngling. We move. Now. Quickly, but quietly. They pressed on, but the shadow continued to follow, weaving through the smoke above. The youngling trilled again, its tiny claws clutching at Jaden's suit. It wasn't just fear in its voice, there was something else, a sense of familiarity. Is it calling to it? Lyra whispered. Captain, what if this thing knows the youngling? What if it's not here to hurt us? Jaden considered this, their mind racing. The youngling had shown an understanding of its surroundings that went beyond basic survival instincts. If this massive creature was part of its world, perhaps it wasn't a threat after all. But they couldn't be sure. Not yet. Let's get back to the ship first, Jaden said. Then we'll figure out what we're dealing with. The crew nodded and pressed on. The massive shadow above didn't attack, but it also didn't leave. It followed them, always keeping its distance, just at the edge of visibility. The youngling's calls grew louder, more insistent. Finally, they reached the base of the outcrop where their ship lay perched. The familiar sight of the hull, scorched but intact, filled them with a sliver of hope. Jaden motioned for the crew to climb. Get inside. Secure the youngling. We'll deal with whatever's out there once we're safe. Eris and Lyra climbed quickly, helping each other up the jagged slope. Malin followed, moving more slowly, his suit servos straining after the long trek. Jaden brought up the rear, cradling the youngling carefully. As they reached the top, the youngling's cries reached a fever pitch. It twisted in Jaden's grip, pointing back toward the shadow. Jaden turned, their visor reflecting the glowing landscape below. For the first time, they got a clear look at what was following them. A massive, serpentine creature with glowing eyes and smooth, charcoal-black scales rose from the haze. Its body was impossibly long, coiling and uncoiling as it moved. The air around it seemed to shimmer even more intensely, as if the heat radiated from its very skin. Yet it didn't attack. Instead, it hovered just beyond the edge of the slope, staring at them, at the youngling. Jaden froze, their breath catching. What are you? They murmured. The youngling wriggled free of their arms, landing lightly on the ground. It stood on shaky legs and made a series of sharp, melodic chirps. The massive creature responded with a low, rumbling sound. The crew watched, stunned. Lyra took a cautious step forward. Captain, it's communicating. With that thing. Jaden held up a hand. Stay back. Let's see what happens. The youngling chirped again, and the creature lowered its head slightly, its glowing eyes fixed on the small figure. It made a deep, resonant hum, and the youngling tilted its head, chirping in response. It was a conversation. A language of tones and vibrations. Jaden felt a strange mix of awe and fear. If these creatures were intelligent, if they had their own form of communication, it meant this planet wasn't just a fiery wasteland. It was a world with its own ecosystem, its own inhabitants, possibly even a civilization. But why was the youngling alone? And why did it need their help to survive? The creature let out a final, low rumble and began to retreat, its massive form blending into the haze once more. The youngling turned back to Jaden and the crew, its body swaying slightly. It looked tired, but there was something in its posture, something that resembled gratitude. Eris was the first to break the silence. What just happened? Lyra shook her head. I think it said goodbye. Jaden knelt in front of the youngling. You knew it, didn't you? That thing, whatever it is, it wasn't here to hurt us. It was here for you. The youngling made a soft, mournful sound, lowering its head. Jaden exhaled slowly. All right. Let's get you inside. The crew entered the ship, the airlock hissing shut behind them. Inside, the atmosphere was calmer, the sounds of the raging planet muffled. Jaden set the youngling down on a makeshift bed, watching as it curled up, exhausted. We need to figure out what to do next, Jaden said. That thing out there. Was it its parent? Lyra asked softly. Maybe, Jaden said. But if it was, why didn't it take the youngling with it? Why leave it behind? Eris looked at the scanners. Maybe it can't survive off this planet. Or maybe it knew we could keep the youngling safer than it could. Jaden sighed. Whatever the reason, we're responsible for this little one now. We can't leave it here. It wouldn't survive on its own. Malin, who had been silent since they boarded, finally spoke. Then we'll find a way to get it to safety. Maybe there's a habitable world nearby. Somewhere we can take it. Jaden nodded, their determination hardening. Right. We'll plot a course and see what's out there. But first, let's get the ship operational again. Eris, start the repairs. Lyra, check our navigational data and see if we can pinpoint a safe destination. Malin, help me secure the youngling and make sure it has everything it needs. The crew moved quickly, each member falling into their role. Despite the exhaustion, they worked with a renewed sense of purpose. This was no longer just a survival mission. It was a rescue mission. As Jaden watched the youngling doze off, its small chest rising and falling with each breath, they felt a flicker of hope. This planet had thrown everything it had at them, and yet they'd survived. Now, with the youngling safe inside and the ship being prepared for takeoff, they dared to believe that they could get off this fiery world and find a better future, for themselves and for the fragile life they'd saved. But even as they turned back to their duties, a thought lingered at the edge of their mind. That massive creature out there, it had let them go. It had communicated with the youngling. And it had chosen not to follow them inside the ship. What did it know that they didn't? The faint hum of the ship's damaged systems was an oddly comforting backdrop as the crew worked. Inside the battered hull, the air was breathable, the temperature steady, no longer the blistering furnace outside. Yet, even with this temporary relief, the atmosphere among the crew was tense. They had been through too much, and the fiery planet was far from done testing them. Jaden leaned against the bulkhead, scanning the room. Lyra was poring over navigation data, her brow furrowed in concentration. Eris sat cross-legged on the floor, a jumble of tools around them, muttering as they patched another damaged circuit. Malin stood near the youngling, who was curled up in a makeshift cradle of blankets and padding. The creature seemed calmer now, its breathing even and its iridescent skin dimming to a more muted glow, resting, perhaps. Captain, Lyra said, her voice cutting through the tense quiet. I've found a possible escape route. It's not ideal, but it's better than nothing. Jaden pushed off the wall and crossed the room. What are we looking at? Lyra pointed at the screen, where a simplified map of the nearby system was displayed. There's a cluster of small moons about 2 light-years from here. One of them has a breathable atmosphere. It's not charted on any of our standard star maps, but the readings suggest it's stable and temperate. If we can get the engines running at even half capacity, we could reach it in a few days. Eris looked up from their work. The engines won't be at half capacity anytime soon. Maybe a quarter, if we're lucky. That last eruption fried a lot of the secondary power systems. We're basically duct taping this ship back together. Jaden placed a hand on the console, studying the map. A quarter capacity is still progress. We'll make do. They turned back to Eris. Do what you can. I know this ship isn't in great shape, but we're not staying on this planet any longer than we have to. Not after what we've seen out there. Eris nodded, their lips pressed into a thin line. I'll keep at it. Just as Jaden was about to give the order to start preparing for liftoff, a low rumble shook the ship. At first, they thought it was another tremor from the planet's unstable surface, but it didn't feel right. It wasn't the deep, seismic groaning they'd come to expect. It was rhythmic, deliberate. The youngling stirred, its small form trembling. It emitted a soft, plaintive chirp, and its translucent eyes fluttered open. What's wrong with it? Malin asked, stepping closer. Jaden's stomach tightened. I don't think it's sick or hurt. It's scared. The rumbling grew louder, accompanied by a distant, echoing roar. It wasn't the same as the massive creature they'd seen before. This sound was sharper, more guttural, and it was getting closer. Eris, Jaden said, their voice urgent, run an external scan. Find out what's out there. Eris scrambled to a console and tapped frantically at the controls. The ship's external sensors were still damaged, but they managed to pull up a crude feed. What appeared on the screen made everyone freeze. A group of smaller, more aggressive-looking creatures was closing in on the ship. They were fast, moving on all fours, their skin a mottled, heat-resistant armor. They looked like predators, sleek and efficient, their glowing eyes locked onto the ship as they bounded over the cracked terrain. Those aren't friendly, Lyra muttered, her voice low. No, they're not, Jaden agreed. Eris, how long until the engines are operational enough to lift off? Hours, Eris said. Maybe more. We don't have hours, Jaden replied, their jaw tightening. Malin, Lyra, get to the airlock. Arm yourselves and secure the entrance. Don't engage unless absolutely necessary. I'll stay here with the youngling and help Eris finish the repairs. Malin hesitated, then nodded. Understood. Lyra followed, and the two of them disappeared down the corridor toward the ship's entrance. Jaden turned back to Eris. What do you need from me? Honestly? Eris said, not looking up. Someone to keep me calm. I'm doing everything I can, but we're short on time and materials. This ship was never designed for this kind of heat, let alone these kinds of repairs. Jaden placed a steadying hand on their shoulder. You've got this. I know it feels like we're running on fumes, but you've kept us alive so far. Keep that streak going. Eris nodded, taking a deep breath. They went back to work, their hands moving with renewed focus. At the airlock, Lyra and Malin secured the entrance with whatever they could find. The ship's automated defenses were offline, so they resorted to handheld energy rifles and a few hastily rigged barricades. The rumbling grew closer, the sound of claws scraping against stone and the guttural growls of the approaching predators echoing through the hull. They're right outside, Malin said quietly. Lyra adjusted her grip on her weapon. We need to hold them off until Eris gets those engines running. If they get inside. They won't, Malin interrupted. We won't let them. Back in the ship's main chamber, Jaden knelt by the youngling. It looked up at them with wide, uncertain eyes. Jaden spoke softly, hoping their tone would be enough to convey reassurance. "We're going to get out of here," they said. "I don't know how, but we'll find a way. You just hang on, okay?" The youngling let out a faint, musical chirp. It wasn't much, but it was enough to bolster Jaden's resolve. The ship shuddered as something heavy struck the hull. Lyra's voice came over the comm, "Captain, they're trying to break through. We've got a few minutes at best." Jaden's jaw clenched. "Eris, how close are you?" "I need another 20 minutes, Eris said. "Maybe 15 if I cut corners. But I can't just snap my fingers, this takes time." "We don't have 20 minutes, Jaden said. "Do what you can." Another impact shook the ship, louder this time. The predators were relentless, clawing and striking at the airlock. Malin and Lyra fired warning shots through the small observation port, but it only seemed to enrage the creatures. Inside, the air felt heavy, charged with tension. Jaden paced, glancing between Eris and the youngling. They could feel the weight of their decisions pressing down on them. They had brought this crew to a planet no one knew, they had chosen to rescue a youngling they didn't understand, and now they were facing predators that seemed determined to rip through the ship's hull. But giving up wasn't an option. "Eris, do whatever you have to do," Jaden said. "I don't care about the ship's long-term viability. Just get us enough power to lift off and get clear of this planet. We can worry about repairs later." Eris nodded grimly. "Understood." The predators outside let out a collective roar, and another impact rocked the ship. Jaden's voice cut through the calm. "Lyra, Malin, hold the line for a few more minutes. We're almost there." Lyra responded, her voice strained. "We'll try, but there," a loud crash interrupted her, followed by the sound of weapons fire. Jaden didn't wait to hear more. They grabbed a sidearm from the nearby weapons locker and sprinted toward the airlock. "Eris, keep working. I'll hold them off if I have to." As Jaden reached the entrance, they found Lyra and Malin holding their ground against the creatures that had begun forcing their way inside. The predators were as terrifying up close as they had seemed on the sensors. Their glowing eyes burned with feral intensity, and their armored bodies gleamed under the emergency lights. Jaden fired, driving one back, and shouted, "We're almost there. Hold on." The next few moments blurred into a frantic struggle. Jaden and the others used every ounce of their strength and skill to hold the line, but the predators were relentless. Just when it seemed the creatures would overwhelm them, the ship's engines let out a deep, rumbling thrum. Eris's voice came over the comm, triumphant but breathless. "We have power. Lifting off now." The ship shook violently as it rose from the ground. The predators screeched in anger, their claws scrabbling against the floor as the ship pulled away. One by one, they lost their footing and fell, disappearing into the fiery landscape below. Jaden staggered back, breathing heavily. The ship climbed higher, the rumbling and roaring of the planet fading behind them. They helped Lyra and Malin to their feet, then made their way back to the main chamber. Eris looked up from their console, sweat streaking their soot-covered face. "We're not out of the woods yet, but we're in the air. That's something." Jaden nodded, their gaze shifting to the youngling. It was trembling, but its eyes met theirs. In that moment, Jaden felt the weight lift just slightly. They had faced yet another danger, and they were still standing. The fight wasn't over, but they had taken a step closer to survival, and to giving this small, fragile life a chance. The ship strained against the gravitational pull of the fiery planet, its engines roaring like a wounded beast. The crew stood around the console, their expressions grim as the screen flickered with warning lights. Although they had escaped immediate danger, the ship was far from stable. It climbed sluggishly, shuddering as the engines struggled to maintain thrust. "Stabilizing, barely," Eris said, their voice tight as they wrestled with the control systems. "We're burning through fuel faster than we should. If we don't level off soon, we'll fall right back down." Jaden's eyes darted to the youngling, who lay curled up in a small nest of blankets. Its breathing was steady, but its faint chirps carried a note of unease. It had been through too much already. They couldn't afford to fail now. "Keep us climbing," Jaden said, their voice firm. "We just need to break through the atmosphere. After that, we'll figure out how to keep moving." Eris nodded and focused on the controls. The ship rattled again, and the emergency lights flickered. It felt as though the entire vessel might come apart at any moment. Meanwhile, Lyra stood by the navigation console, her hands gripping the edges tightly. "Captain, even if we make it into space, we're looking at a long trip to find a safe haven. Without proper repairs, I don't know if we can handle that kind of distance." Jaden stared at the flickering screen, their jaw clenched. "We don't have another option. We keep going. We find that moon you mentioned, or we look for something else. But we're not stopping here." A sharp beeping drew everyone's attention. Eris looked down at the readout and cursed under their breath. "We've got company." Jaden turned to the main screen. At first, they saw nothing but the swirling ash and fire of the planet's upper atmosphere. Then, faint shapes began to emerge. More of the aggressive, four-legged creatures were in pursuit, leaping from jagged cliffs and rocky outcrops. Some even clawed their way up a molten ridge in a desperate attempt to reach the ascending ship. "They're not giving up," Malin muttered, his voice grim. "They're trying to take us down before we escape." Jaden narrowed their eyes. "Eris, can you push the engines harder?" "I'm already pushing them as hard as they'll go," Eris said. "Any more and we risk a total burnout." "Then we have to buy ourselves some time," Jaden said. "Lyra, Malin, man the remaining turrets. Take out whatever you can." The two crew members nodded and hurried to their stations. Moments later, the ship's external cannons came online. They weren't in the best shape, one fired sporadically, while another struggled to hold a steady aim, but it was better than nothing. The first few bursts lit up the sky, striking the cliffs and sending chunks of rock tumbling down. Some of the creatures fell, but more continued to climb, their glowing eyes locked on the ship. "We can't keep this up for long," Lyra said over the comms. "They're too fast, and we're running out of ammo." "We just need to hold them off a little longer," Jaden replied. "Eris, how's the altitude?" Eris tapped at the console, their hands shaking from both exertion and stress. "We're almost clear of the atmosphere. Another few hundred meters and we'll be out of range." The ship groaned as another tremor rippled through it. This time, it wasn't the planet's fault, it was the strain of pushing a damaged vessel beyond its limits. The floor beneath Jaden's feet vibrated, and a shower of sparks erupted from a nearby panel. "We're losing integrity in the aft section," Eris said. "If that goes, we lose propulsion." Jaden's mind raced. They needed to think fast. "What about the auxiliary thrusters? Can we route power there?" Eris hesitated. "It might work, but we'd lose shielding. We'd be completely exposed." "We're already exposed," Jaden said. "Do it." Eris muttered a curse and began redirecting power. The ship lurched, its engines roaring louder as the auxiliary thrusters kicked in. The climb stabilized slightly, but the external sensors showed the creatures still gaining ground. One leapt higher than the others, its claws scraping against the ship's undercarriage. "They're boarding!" Malin shouted over the comms. "They're tearing into the lower hull." Jaden grabbed their sidearm and sprinted toward the lower deck. "Eris, keep us climbing. Lyra, Malin, hold them off as long as you can. I'll deal with the intruders." The lower deck was a chaotic mess of exposed wires and cracked panels. Jaden could hear the screeching of claws against metal, the sound echoing through the narrow corridors. They raised their weapon, their heart pounding. A sudden crash sent sparks flying as one of the creatures broke through the outer plating. It lunged into the corridor, its glowing eyes fixed on Jaden. They fired, the shot striking the creature in the chest. It staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it roared and charged again. Jaden fired twice more, this time hitting a weak spot in its armored hide. The creature collapsed, its body twitching before going still. Another clawed its way inside, and Jaden repeated the process, sweat dripping down their face as they fought off each attacker. "Captain, we're breaking through the atmosphere." Eris's voice crackled over the comm, "We're almost clear." Jaden didn't let their guard down. They took out one more creature, then slammed the emergency seal on the breach. The ship's automated systems hissed to life, patching the hole with a temporary barrier. They leaned against the wall, their breath coming in gasps. The comm buzzed again. "Captain, we did it," Lyra said. "We're in space." Jaden staggered back to the main chamber, their muscles aching. Eris gave them a weary smile. "We're out of immediate danger. The predators didn't follow us off the surface." Lyra and Malin returned, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. Lyra gave a small, relieved laugh. "We made it." The youngling stirred, its small form trembling slightly. It let out a soft, trilling noise, and Jaden crouched beside it. "We're safe now," Jaden said gently. "We're going to find you a new home." The youngling looked up at them, its translucent eyes reflecting the ship's flickering lights. For a moment, its skin brightened, a faint glow that seemed almost hopeful. "We're not done yet," Jaden said, standing. "Eris, plot a course to the nearest moon with a stable atmosphere. I don't care how long it takes, just get us there." Eris nodded, already inputting coordinates. "On it." Jaden turned to the rest of the crew. "You all did good work down there. I know it wasn't easy, but we pulled through. Now let's make sure we get this little one to safety." The ship hummed quietly as it began its slow journey away from the fiery planet. Although their path ahead was uncertain, the crew felt a flicker of hope. They had faced the worst this hostile world had to offer and come out alive. Now, with the youngling in their care, they set their sights on a new horizon, one that promised a chance at a better future. The glow of the planet faded into the distance, its once terrifying presence reduced to a faint orange dot on the ship's rear monitors. Inside the cramped cabin, the crew finally allowed themselves a moment to breathe. The tension that had gripped them for days seemed to lift slightly as the steady hum of the ship's engines filled the silence. The youngling stirred in its makeshift nest, its iridescent skin shimmering faintly under the soft cabin lights. Jaden knelt beside it, speaking in a low, gentle tone. "We're taking you somewhere safe. Just hold on a little longer." The youngling let out a faint trill, a sound that was no longer desperate but curious, hopeful, even. Lyra leaned against the navigation console, her face drawn but relieved. "We're on course for the nearest habitable moon. The atmosphere looks stable, and there's a chance it might have flora and water sources. I think we'll be able to set down there." "Good," Jaden said, standing. They turned to the rest of the crew. "You all did more than I could have asked. We're alive because of you, because we never gave up on each other. And now, we're going to see this through. Together." Eris rubbed at a smudge of soot on their face, a rare grin breaking through their exhaustion. "Let's just hope that moon's as safe as it looks. I'm all for finding a place where the ground doesn't explode every 5 minutes." The others laughed quietly, the tension in the room easing further. Even Malin, who had been grim and silent throughout much of their ordeal, managed a small, tired smile. "I don't care what it's like, as long as we can breathe and it doesn't try to eat us." Hours passed as the ship steadily approached the moon. The crew worked in shifts, checking systems, tending to the youngling, and preparing for the final landing. The vessel was still battered and barely holding together, but it had gotten them this far. The promise of a stable, life-sustaining environment was all the motivation they needed. When they finally reached orbit around the moon, a collective murmur of relief swept through the crew. The surface below was lush, dotted with green patches that looked like forests and shimmering blue lakes. No signs of volcanic activity, no towering infernos, just calm, solid ground. "Let's get her down in one piece," Jaden said as they settled into the pilot's chair. The crew took their positions, guiding the ship toward a flat clearing near one of the larger lakes. The landing was rough, the ship groaning in protest, but it held together. When the engines powered down, Jaden took a deep breath and looked back at the crew. "We made it. Let's go see what's out there." Together, they stepped outside into the fresh, cool air. The youngling followed, blinking at the bright light and letting out a series of soft, melodious chirps. It wandered a few steps away, testing the ground, and then turned back to the crew with what could only be described as a look of quiet joy. Jaden smiled, feeling a weight lift from their shoulders. "This is a good place," they said. "A good start." The crew stood there, watching as the youngling explored its new home. For the first time in what felt like forever, they felt peace, a sense of accomplishment, and the knowledge that they had given this fragile life a chance to thrive.